Hi, welcome to this part of my review featuring Children of the Fall. If you haven't seen the other parts of my review featuring this GMless story game, please check out the playlist in the description below. This time we are going to talk about dice, complications, and many other things. Children of the Fall makes use of standard 6-sided dice, for all the dice rolling in the game, of course. Dice are only ever rolled when resolving a complication. Generally, you will roll 2 dice and add the value of each die together to determine your total. Your aim is to roll as high as possible. Occasionally, you will roll 3 dice and choose the 2 highest value dice once you have rolled, and add their value together to determine your total. If possible, finding some nice vintage dice or taking a set of regular dice and weathering them to make them feel thematic and apocalyptic can add greatly to the gameplay experience. Let's talk about complications. They are the primary mechanic in Children of the Fall. Complications are a way of adding plot twists and dramatic moments into other players' scenes. If you have an idea for a plot twist or a narrative moment that will add a complication into the active player's scene, this is an ideal time to introduce a complication. When you are the reactive player, at any point during the active player's scene, you may spend one of your available story points to begin a complication. To do this, you take one of your story points and give it to the active player. Once you have done this, you very briefly explain to the active player what the complication will be. Perhaps they could slip and sprain their ankle while running away from a group of fallen, or trigger an alarm while they are sneaking into another tribe's haven. Complications should negatively impact on the active player in an interesting way, a way that has meaning for both the active player's character and the story as a whole as far as possible. The more interesting and dramatic the potential complication, the better. Players should try not to make complications totally catastrophic unless it will work particularly well in the flow of the story. Remember that a complication adds an unexpected twist to the character scene. Usually these involve environmental or other elements. The only stipulation is that you cannot directly affect a player character's action with a complication. You can also use a complication to potentially bring a new character or multiple characters into a scene. Once you have proposed a complication, the active player needs to roll to see whether the complication actually happens or they manage to avoid it. To determine the outcome of a complication, the active player rolls 2 dice. If the result is 8 or more, then they avoid the complication. They still keep the story point that they gain from the reactive player, but the scene continues as normal. You may still choose to incorporate a less catastrophic version of the complication into your narration, or have your character narrowly avoid the catastrophe in some way. If the result is 7 or less, then the complication happens. The active player continues with their scene, but they include the complication in their narration. The active player also marks a trauma point on their character sheet. Let's talk about trauma points and downfalls. Downfalls are story prompts that get incorporated into the narrative as a campaign progresses based on your success at dealing with complications. Each character has 3 unique downfalls, which vary from playbook to playbook. Downfalls are narrative prompts for negative events that can happen to your character throughout the game. These are often thematically linked to your character playbook, with the 3rd and final downfall often being death, or a fate even worse. Downfalls are triggered by failing 3 complications. When you roll for a complication and you fail the roll, you have a dice result of 7 or less, that is. Not only does the complication trigger, but you also mark a trauma point. There is a track for this in the character playbooks. When you mark your 3rd trauma point, erase all the trauma points on the track and choose one of the downfalls on your character playbook. The downfall you select is the narrative prompt that you have to weave into the story. If you mark the downfall during Act 1 or 2, you need to incorporate the downfall into your character's story by the end of the current session. If the downfall is marked during Act 3 or 4, you need to incorporate it into this session or Act 1 or 2 of the next session. You may not be the target of any more complications until you have resolved the downfall. Each downfall on your character playbook can only be selected once. Let's talk about determination. Each player has a single determination point per session. These do not accumulate between sessions. When rolling for a complication on your turn, you may spend your determination point, making a note of this by filling in the space on your character playbook, to roll 3 dice instead of 2. After rolling, you discard the lowest value dice and keep the highest 2 remaining dice. Determination points are points that give you a slightly higher chance of avoiding a complication. Let's talk about the Helix point. Each player has a single Helix point, which they can spend at any time during the game session to change the outcome of any single die roll. This could be to avoid a particularly nasty complication from triggering, or to enable a complication that you think is narratively interesting. You can spend your Helix point to affect your own complication rolls or another player's complication rolls. Helix points do not accumulate and are not transferred. Once they are spent, they are gone, and each player only has 1 per session. You may also not stack on top of another Helix point played by another player to cancel the effect they have just triggered, which would be effectively reversing an already reversed die roll outcome. Now, concerning the timeline, you may within reason fast forward the timeline. Flashbacks can be used to create drama and add tension to the current storyline that is busy unfolding around the table. It's also important to note when to start and when to end a scene. Concerning character death, over the course of the game, the character that you are controlling may die, an unfortunate side effect of the end of the world. There are no hit points or damage tracks. If your character dies in the story, then they die, as simple as that. If your character dies in the first half of the game session, you can choose another playbook and create a new character which will join the game from that point on. When your character dies during the second half of the game session, you can still frame scenes and play as normal, although the scenes will take the form of flashbacks or will be regular scenes where your character is not present. This is the only time when you can frame scenes where your character is not present in the scene. Now, concerning managing the spotlight, it should be the aim of each player to give every character fairly equal screen time or spotlight. This is a story game after all. There should not be a single main protagonist in the stories you explore. Each character's own story arcs and narrative threads should be explored as equally as possible. Often during the course of the game, elements of the tribe and/or the haven will change. Perhaps a new leader is elected. Maybe someone is killed or an important project is completed or destroyed. At the end of a session, update the tribe and haven sheets to reflect these changes. You may also make updates to these sheets during play as long as it doesn't take too much time away from the scene framing, of course. And this concludes this part of the review. In the next part we are going to talk about characters. I like the way in which the different sequences, or rather the turns of events, can be modified through these mechanisms. And you don't feel forced, it doesn't feel like there is no choice for your character as you are telling the story in this story game. There are ways for you to shift or divert or steer the story towards particular situations, events, and whatnot through the use of determination points, and you can employ Helix points to spice things up as well. Thank you for watching this part of the review, and thank you for your likes and your comments. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that are going the extra mile to support the channel. If anyone else wishes to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. And remember, it is better to roleplay and fail in character than not to roleplay and fail as a player. Once again, thank you, and see you later.